The storm raged across the Martian wasteland, whipping up red dust that clung to everything like a curse. Darian Holt pulled his coat tighter around his body as he trudged through the abandoned sector. He was a mechanic, not an explorer, but scavenging old wrecks had become second nature on a colony where supplies were scarce. His boots crunched against the rocky ground as he climbed over the remains of a long-forgotten transport pod. Then he saw it, a small, sleek escape pod half buried in the sand, its outer shell scorched from re-entry. It wasn't human-made. Darian hesitated. Alien tech meant trouble. The colony had strict rules about dealing with off-world debris, but something about this pod unsettled him. The hatch had been blown open, and faint scratches marked the metal. Something, or someone, had forced their way out. A soft sound carried over the wind. A whimper. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he stepped closer, peering into the wreckage. At first, he saw nothing but twisted metal and scattered wires. Then his gaze fell on a small figure curled in the shadows. A child. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, but she was unlike any child he had ever seen. Her delicate skin shimmered faintly under the dim Martian sun, marked with glowing violet patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. Her long silver hair was tangled, and her large, luminous eyes flickered open, locking onto him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She tried to move, but her limbs trembled, too weak to stand. Darian crouched beside her, keeping his voice calm. "Hey, kid, can you hear me?" The girl flinched but didn't speak. Her fingers gripped a small metal pendant around her neck, holding it close like a lifeline. Darian glanced around. Whoever or whatever had left her here was long gone. If he walked away now, she wouldn't survive the night. He sighed. "All right, kid. Let's get you out of here." Carefully, he wrapped her in his coat and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as if gravity barely touched her. She stiffened at first, but then rested her head against his shoulder, too tired to resist. By the time Darian reached his transport, the storm had worsened. Sand pelted against the windshield as he activated the autopilot, setting a course for the colony. He glanced down at the girl in the passenger seat. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered. She just stared at him, unblinking. Darian sighed again, rubbing his temples. He had spent years avoiding complications, but now he had just taken in a lost alien child with no idea who she was or where she came from. And somewhere in the dark void of space, someone was looking for her. Darian Holt had never taken care of a child before, let alone an alien one. But here he was, standing in his small Martian home, watching the strange girl as she sat silently on his couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her glowing violet eyes flickered around the room, scanning everything as if she had never seen anything like it before. Maybe she hadn't. She was still weak from whatever had happened to her before he found her. He had tried asking her questions, her name, where she came from, how she ended up in that wreck, but she didn't respond. Either she didn't understand him, or she didn't trust him yet. Probably both. Darian ran a hand through his messy dark hair. "All right, kid. You gotta eat something." He walked to the small kitchen, opening a cabinet filled with protein packs. Martian food wasn't great, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed a pouch, tore it open, and handed it to her. "Here, it's not fancy, but it'll keep you alive." She hesitated, staring at the food like it might bite her. Then, slowly, she took the pouch and sniffed it. Darian wasn't sure what he expected, maybe for her to reject it. But after a few moments, she took a small sip. Her face scrunched up in disgust, but she swallowed it down. He chuckled. "Yeah, I know. Tastes like cardboard." The girl looked up at him, tilting her head. It was the first real reaction she had given. Maybe she was starting to understand him. For the next few days, Darian did his best to care for her. He gave her a place to sleep, shared his rations, and even let her borrow an old shirt to wear since her torn jumpsuit barely held together. She moved carefully around his home, touching things like she was trying to memorize them. But she still hadn't spoken a word. That changed on the fourth night. Darian was working on a busted circuit panel in the corner when he heard a soft voice behind him. Lyra. He froze, then turned around. The girl was sitting cross-legged on the floor, looking straight at him. "What did you say?" She placed a hand on her chest. "Lyra." Darian blinked. Was that her name? It had to be. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Lyra, huh? All right. Nice to meet you, Lyra." She gave a tiny nod, then pointed at him. "You?" He smirked. "Darian." Lyra's mouth moved as she repeated, "Darian." Her voice was soft, but there was something steady about it. Strong. From that moment, things changed. She began to follow him everywhere, watching everything he did. She learned fast, too fast. Within a week, she started mimicking his movements, figuring out how to use his tools just by observing. And then there were the strange things. One morning, Darian woke up to find the broken circuit panel he had been struggling with completely fixed. Wires neatly arranged, connections restored. He knew he hadn't done it. There was only one other person in the house. He looked at Lyra, who sat on the floor, humming softly to herself as she drew patterns in the dust with her fingers. Her glowing violet markings shimmered faintly in the dim light. "Did you fix the panel?" he asked. She didn't answer at first, just glanced at him, then back at her drawing. Darian sighed. "All right, you're officially the weirdest kid I've ever met." Lyra just smiled, her first real smile. For a brief moment, Darian forgot that he had found her in the wreckage of an alien escape pod. That she had abilities no human child should have. That someone out there was probably looking for her. For now, she was just a kid. And for now, she was safe. The wind howled across the Martian plains, kicking up dust and making it almost impossible to see. But Darian Holt didn't care about the storm outside. His thoughts were focused on the task at hand. Lyra was sitting on the couch, absorbed in a book he had found for her. She had made remarkable progress with her reading and writing, far faster than any child he'd ever known. He was beginning to think that maybe she wasn't just some lost refugee, as he'd first believed. But then he wasn't sure what she was, only that she wasn't like any human child. Darian wiped his brow and turned back to the control panel in his small workshop. The power grid had been acting up lately, and he needed to fix it before it caused a major problem. Lyra had already fixed the previous electrical issue without even asking, and Darian was starting to wonder just how much she truly understood. But when he heard the thud of a boot against the floor outside, his heart skipped a beat. Someone was at the door. He quickly turned off his tools, wiping his hands on a rag as he glanced at Lyra. She hadn't heard it yet, but Darian felt an uneasy tension creep over him. He wasn't expecting anyone. His first thought was that it was a neighbor, maybe someone from the nearby colony, but the last thing he wanted was to explain why he was harboring a strange child who clearly wasn't human. Then the knock came again, louder this time, and something about the rhythm sent a chill down his spine. Darian took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, glancing at Lyra one more time. She had stopped reading and was watching him with her big violet eyes, her head slightly tilted, as if she knew something he didn't. He opened the door slowly. Standing outside was a tall, imposing figure in dark combat armor, a rifle slung across his back. The man's face was hidden behind a reflective visor, but Darian could feel the coldness radiating from him. Behind the soldier stood two more, both of them similarly dressed. "Are you Darian Holt?" the lead soldier asked, his voice flat and professional. Darian's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you?" The soldier didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned Darian from head to toe, then glanced past him into the house. The soldier's eyes narrowed when he saw Lyra in the background, but he didn't seem surprised. "I'm Commander Calvor, "We've been looking for someone," the soldier said, his voice colder now. "An alien child. She's here, isn't she?" Darian's blood ran cold. He had expected something like this, but hearing it aloud made it all too real. They knew. "Who's asking?" Darian's voice was steady, but his fingers clenched into fists. Commander Vor took a step forward, his eyes hard. "The authorities have orders. The child is a threat to the stability of this colony. She's to be handed over immediately." Lyra's small voice echoed from behind Darian. "No." Darian turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. The glow in her violet eyes dimmed, but it wasn't from a lack of light. It was fear. "You don't understand," Darian said, stepping in front of her. "She's just a child. You're not taking her anywhere." Commander Vor's expression didn't change. "You don't have a choice in this, Holt. You've been harboring a fugitive. Surrender the child now, and we'll leave you both unharmed." But Darian wasn't about to back down. He wasn't going to hand over the one person who had come to mean more to him than anything else in the universe. "I'm not going to say it again," Darian said, his voice firm. "You leave, or I'll make you leave." A small laugh escaped from Vor, though it wasn't a laugh of amusement. "You'll regret this." Before Darian could react, the door slid open wider, and a group of armed men in black tactical suits stormed in, weapons raised. The situation was spiraling out of control quickly. Darian glanced at Lyra, who was shaking now. He had to act fast. "I don't want any trouble," Darian said, trying to buy time. "But I will not let you hurt her." Lyra stepped forward then, her eyes glowing brighter than ever. She raised a hand, and suddenly, the soldiers in the doorway froze. Darian's heart pounded as he watched her. It was as if she was controlling them without even touching them. The soldiers struggled, trying to move, but their bodies wouldn't obey. Commander Vor's voice was low but commanding. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Darian didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. The game had changed. Darian Holt stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide as he watched the soldiers struggle against an unseen force. Lyra, her eyes glowing brighter than ever, had raised her hand, and with a flick of her wrist, rendered them immobile. Their rifles hung limply by their sides, their bodies rigid, as though they were caught in an invisible web. "What the hell is happening?" Darian whispered to himself, unable to tear his gaze from Lyra. She was just a child. She couldn't. But then he saw the determination in her eyes, the fierce concentration as she controlled the soldiers, effortlessly holding them in place. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Commander Vor, who had once seemed unshakable in his authority, was now sweating, his attempts to break free futile. He glared at Darian, his voice a low snarl. "You don't know what you've unleashed, Holt. You've just made a terrible mistake." Darian took a step back, his heart racing. "What are you talking about? She's just a kid." Lyra's small voice was surprisingly steady. "I'm not just a kid." Her words, though soft, carried an undeniable weight. Darian's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't just a kid. He looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she was in control of herself. "What do you mean, Lyra?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered back to the soldiers, still frozen in place, their faces twisted in frustration. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand. As if on cue, the soldiers collapsed to the ground, their limbs suddenly working again, but they were too disoriented to stand. "Lyra," Darian started, his voice full of concern, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "They want to hurt me, Darian," she said quietly. "I can't let them." Darian's mind raced. He'd known something was different about her from the moment he'd found her, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Commander Vor slowly rose to his feet, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "You don't understand, child," he sneered. "You are not just an orphan. You are a weapon. And he pointed to the soldiers behind him, "have been sent to retrieve you. You belong to someone else. Darian's confusion deepened. A weapon? Who was Lyra really? Lyra's eyes narrowed. I don't belong to anyone. Her voice held a dangerous calm that made Darian take a step back, suddenly unsure whether she was truly the innocent child he had been caring for. The soldiers struggled to their feet, but their hands remained raised in surrender. Commander Vor's voice softened, though there was no kindness in it. You don't know your own power, do you? You were born for a purpose, Lyra. A purpose you can't escape. Lyra's face remained unreadable. I'm not your weapon. I don't want your purpose. Darian's heart pounded. This wasn't just a child he had found. She was tied to something much bigger than he could have imagined. He needed answers, but the soldiers weren't going to give him any. Who sent you? Darian demanded, stepping forward, his fists clenched. Why are you after her? Vor chuckled darkly, his visor gleaming in the dim light. You still don't get it, do you? Lyra is the heir to the throne of an ancient empire, an empire that has been waiting for her return. Her destiny is to lead them, to reign. And if you think you can hide her from that, you're wrong. Darian's world tilted. An empire, a throne, Lyra, and heir to some alien kingdom. He had found a lost child, not a princess. Lyra stepped forward, standing protectively in front of Darian. I don't care about their throne. I care about being free. Darian's mind raced, trying to process everything. He had always been a mechanic, a simple man with simple problems. But now he was caught in the middle of something far beyond his understanding. He had no idea what kind of empire Lyra was connected to, but he knew one thing for sure. No matter her past, she was still the girl he had saved from that wreckage. And he wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. You won't take her, Darian said, his voice low but firm. Not while I'm here. Commander Vor's expression hardened, but he said nothing. He turned to his soldiers, who now stood ready to follow his command. The tension in the room was palpable, as if a storm was brewing, ready to explode. The stakes had just risen higher than Darian could have imagined. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to back down. Darian Holt's hands tightened into fists, his heart thundering in his chest as he stared down Commander Vor and his soldiers. The situation had escalated quickly, and the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. Lyra, standing beside him, was no longer the innocent child he had taken in. There was a power within her that Darian couldn't fully understand, and it frightened him as much as it gave him hope. Vor stepped forward, his visor gleaming in the dim light. You still don't get it, do you? He said coldly. Lyra belongs to us. She is the rightful ruler of an empire that spans galaxies. And if you think you can hide her from her destiny, you're wrong. This is beyond you. Darian's mind raced. He had never signed up for any of this. He had just wanted to help a lost child. No, not just a child. A girl who had clearly been abandoned, running from something far more dangerous than he could understand. But now, standing in front of him, was the terrifying reality. Lyra was not only an alien, but she was also an heir to an empire. Lyra's glowing violet eyes met Vor's with defiance. I don't belong to you, she said firmly, her voice carrying an edge of power that sent a shiver down Darian's spine. She wasn't the frightened little girl she had once been. She had changed, grown stronger, more confident. Vor's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. You'll come with us, whether you like it or not. The Empire will not wait forever. And if you refuse, we'll take you by force. Lyra didn't flinch, her gaze unyielding. I don't care about your empire. I care about being free. I won't go with you. The tension in the room was unbearable, the weight of the situation pressing down on Darian like a physical force. He wanted to protect her, to keep her safe, but the soldiers standing in front of him were trained professionals. He was just a mechanic. What could he do? But then he looked at Lyra again, and something inside him clicked. She wasn't just any girl. She had the power to control things. things that Darian couldn't even begin to comprehend. He didn't know how, but he knew she wasn't alone in this. If she was going to face these people, he was going to stand by her. Darian stepped forward, his voice steadied despite the fear gnawing at him. "You're not taking her. You're not taking anyone from here." Vor's eyes narrowed, and he gave a sharp command to his soldiers. "Prepare to move in. We take her now." The moment Vor spoke, the soldiers advanced, moving quickly and with military precision. Darian's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He wasn't going to let them take Lyra without a fight. And then it happened. Lyra raised her hand again, and the soldiers froze in their tracks. Darian watched in awe as the air seemed to ripple around her. She was controlling them again, but this time it was more powerful than before. The soldiers struggled, their bodies twitching as though they were caught in a force field, unable to move an inch. Vor growled in frustration, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but he couldn't pull it free. Lyra's control over the soldiers was absolute, and Darian could see the strain in her face, the effort it took to hold them at bay. But she wasn't backing down. "You don't get to decide my future," Lyra said, her voice low but filled with authority. "I'll choose what I want, not you, not anyone." Darian's chest swelled with pride as he looked at her. She was strong, stronger than he could have imagined. It was clear now. Lyra wasn't just a girl caught in the middle of a war. She was a force to be reckoned with. Commander Vor finally relented, his voice dripping with contempt. "This isn't over, Lyra. You'll regret this. The Empire will never let you go." Darian stood his ground, a protective hand on Lyra's shoulder. "We'll deal with that when it comes. But for now, you're not going anywhere." The soldiers, still frozen, glared at them, but no one moved. The room was thick with the weight of their unspoken battle, but in that moment, Darian knew that they had won. For now, they were safe. Lyra lowered her hand, and the soldiers slowly began to regain control of their bodies, though they remained eerily still. She turned to Darian, her face tired but determined. "They won't stop coming, will they?" Darian shook his head. "No, but we'll be ready." As he spoke those words, Darian realized just how much his life had changed. He had no idea what he was stepping into, but there was no turning back now. He wasn't just protecting an alien girl. He was protecting a force that could change the future of the galaxy, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The days after the confrontation with Commander Vor felt like a tense lull before a storm. Darian Holt kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for any signs of movement, any hint that the soldiers might return. Lyra had withdrawn into herself a bit, her mind clearly preoccupied with what had happened and the weight of the revelations about her true nature. But Darian refused to let fear take hold. She wasn't just a girl caught in a war she didn't ask for. She was family now, and he would protect her at all costs. They kept their routine simple. Darian worked on the repairs around the house, while Lyra practiced her reading and tried to understand more about Earth. It wasn't easy for her, not with all the memories of her past, the Empire, her royal blood, the responsibilities she didn't want, lingering in her mind. Darian noticed how she often looked out the window as if waiting for something or someone to come. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Darian found Lyra standing by the window, staring into the distance. Her eyes were distant, her expression unreadable. It was a look Darian had seen before, the kind of look that meant something heavy was on her mind. "Lyra," he called softly, stepping up beside her. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Darian feared that she might push him away again. But then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel them, Darian. They're getting closer. The soldiers, they'll come again." Darian felt a chill run down his spine. He had tried to keep her safe, keep her hidden, but deep down, he had known that it wouldn't be long before they came back. The Empire wasn't something that could be outrun. "We'll be ready," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But just as he was about to say more, a loud bang echoed from the front door. Darian's heart raced. It was too soon. They couldn't have found them already. Before he could react, the door swung open, and standing there in the doorway was someone Darian never expected to see. "Darian, you need to listen to me." The voice was familiar, and Darian's blood ran cold. It was Marcus, a friend he had trusted, someone who had worked with him for years on various projects. But the look on Marcus' face now, the urgency in his eyes, told Darian everything he needed to know. "What's going on?" Darian asked, his tone guarded. Marcus stepped into the room, his expression tense. "They know, Darian. The Empire. They're not just looking for Lyra. They're looking for you too. You've become a target by association." Lyra stiffened beside Darian, her body going rigid as she turned toward Marcus. "What do you mean? Who's looking for us?" Marcus swallowed, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "It's not just the soldiers. Someone higher up in the Empire wants to reclaim Lyra. They think you're hiding her, Darian, and they're willing to do anything to get her back." Darian's mind raced. He had always known that the truth about Lyra's heritage would eventually catch up to them, but he hadn't prepared for this. He had always trusted Marcus, but now, as the weight of the situation bore down on him, he began to wonder how much he really knew about his old friend. "I didn't come here to turn you in," Marcus continued, his voice softer now. "But there are things I didn't know about the Empire's reach. I've heard whispers of a plan to send someone after you, someone who can get to you before the soldiers do." Lyra took a step forward, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Who is it?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "A traitor. Someone you both know. Someone close to you." Darian's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Marcus' face grew pale, and his next words hit Darian like a punch to the gut. "It's Sarah." The name hit Darian like a thunderclap. Sarah, his sister. She had always been his closest ally, his rock. He couldn't believe it. The thought that she could be involved in something like this seemed impossible. "No," Darian said, shaking his head in disbelief. That's not possible. Sarah wouldn't. She's already spoken with them, Darian. She's part of the plan to bring Lyra back to the Empire." The words hung in the air like a deadly fog. Darian felt his world shift beneath him. Everything he thought he knew, his life, his family, his friendships, was crumbling. "Why?" Marcus looked away, his face contorted with regret. "She believes in the Empire. She thinks they can offer her something. Hands Lyra over. She'll be rewarded." Darian's mind whirled with confusion and betrayal. How could Sarah do this? How could she turn her back on him, on Lyra? He had trusted her. But as the truth sank in, Darian knew one thing for sure. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. And the fight for Lyra's freedom had just become even more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The weight of betrayal settled heavily over Darian as he stared at Marcus, unable to process the words he had just heard. Sarah, his sister, the one person he had always believed would be there for him, had been working against him this whole time. It felt like his world was crumbling. Lyra, sensing his turmoil, stepped closer, her small hand resting gently on his arm. She didn't say anything, but her presence was a silent reassurance. Darian clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his emotions in check. He needed to think. He couldn't let the panic overwhelm him. There was too much at stake. Lyra's life was at risk, and now so was his. "What now?" he asked, his voice gruff. He turned back to Marcus, his gaze cold. "Is she coming here? To take Lyra?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Darian's eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't come here to make things worse. But if Sarah's involved, it's only a matter of time before she comes for you, Darian. She's already taken steps to track you down. The Empire has resources you can't even imagine." Darian's mind raced as he thought about his sister. She had always been driven, always determined to achieve more. But this This was a level of betrayal he never could have fathomed. How could she possibly want to bring Lyra back to the Empire, knowing how much it would hurt Darien? How could she side with people who saw Lyra as nothing more than a pawn in their game? You're saying she's been spying on us this whole time? Lyra spoke for the first time, her voice low and heavy with disbelief. She's been working for them. Marcus nodded solemnly. Yes, she's been feeding them information about Darien's movements, about your whereabouts. She's been trying to get closer to you, Lyra, trying to learn everything about you and your abilities. It's all part of a bigger plan. Darien's heart clenched at the thought of Sarah's betrayal. He had always been close to her, shared everything with her. Now, it felt like a knife had been twisted into his side. Why? He asked again, his voice raw. Why would she do this? She knows what's at stake. She knows how dangerous the Empire can be. I don't know, Marcus replied, his voice tinged with regret. I don't know what Sarah believes, Darien, but I do know that she thinks she's doing the right thing. She's convinced herself that the Empire will give her the power she's always wanted, and maybe she's right. Maybe she thinks this is the only way she'll get what she deserves. Darien shook his head, his anger rising. She doesn't get it. She doesn't understand what she's putting at risk. She doesn't know what they'll do to Lyra if they get their hands on her. Lyra, standing silently by his side, looked up at him with a mix of concern and determination in her eyes. We can't let them take me, Darien. We can't let them use me to build their empire. I won't let them destroy everything I care about. Darien took a deep breath, focusing on her words. He knew she was right. They couldn't let the Empire win. They couldn't let Sarah's misguided ambitions ruin everything. What do we do now? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. How do we stop her? How do we keep Lyra safe? Darien felt a surge of determination flood through him. He wasn't going to let Sarah's betrayal define this moment. He wasn't going to let her tear everything apart. We fight back, he said firmly. We find out what she's planning and stop it before it's too late. Lyra nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. I've faced worse. I've survived worse. And I will fight for what's mine. I won't let anyone take it from me. Darien turned to Marcus, his expression hardening. You'll help us, won't you? Marcus hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded. I'll do what I can. I owe you that much. Darien's gaze softened slightly. Thank you. We're going to need all the help we can get. The room fell silent again, but this time there was a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer victims in this situation. They were going to take control of their fate. They were going to stop Sarah and the Empire before it was too late. But Darien couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, and the enemy was closer than ever. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people closest to him. But one thing was clear. He would do whatever it took to protect Lyra. She was no longer just an alien orphan. She was family. And family didn't betray each other. They had to be ready for whatever came next, because, with Sarah working against them, the stakes had just been raised. The days that followed were a blur of planning, evasion, and endless questions. Darien, Lyra, and Marcus had put their heads together to try to figure out a way to stop Sarah and the Empire's relentless pursuit. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized how deeply Sarah had become involved in the Empire's schemes. She was no longer just his sister. She was a piece of a much bigger puzzle, one that involved power, manipulation, and a future he couldn't even begin to understand. Lyra was growing increasingly anxious. She had spent years running from the Empire, hiding who she was, and now she found herself at the center of a fight she never wanted. Yet, as much as she feared the Empire's return, she wasn't going to let them dictate her fate. The strength she had within her was something Darien had come to admire. And now, more than ever, it was clear that this wasn't just his fight. This was hers too. I've been running for so long, Lyra said one evening, her voice soft as she looked out at the night sky. But now I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something bigger. something I can't avoid anymore. Darien stepped closer to her, his gaze unwavering. You don't have to run anymore, Lyra. Not from them, not from anyone. You've got a family now. And we're going to make sure you're safe. We won't let them take you again. Her eyes met his, filled with a quiet resolve. Then let's finish this, Darien. Let's take the fight to them. It was a decision they all knew had to be made. They couldn't keep hiding forever. The Empire had the resources to find them, no matter where they went, and with Sarah working against them, time was running out. If they were going to stop the Empire, they had to confront Sarah, face to face, and end this once and for all. They made their way to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the meeting place Marcus had suggested. It was far enough from the prying eyes of the Empire, but close enough to gather any information they might need. Darien had his doubts. The place felt too quiet, too perfect. But they couldn't afford to second-guess themselves now. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with tension. They knew they were walking into a trap, but they had no other choice. The door creaked as they entered, the sound echoing through the empty space. In the center of the room stood Sarah, her back turned, waiting for them. Darien's heart pounded in his chest as he locked eyes with his sister. She didn't look like the same person he remembered. The warmth in her eyes had been replaced by something colder, harder. She wasn't here to make peace. Sarah, Darien called out, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop. This isn't you. Sarah turned slowly, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, Darien, I'm not the one who's lost. You've always been so naive. You never understood what the Empire could offer, what it could give us. Power, control, a future, something more than just scraping by. Lyra stepped forward, her voice firm. This isn't about power, Sarah. This is about a life. This is about the future we're choosing for ourselves, not for some empire that uses people like pawns. Sarah's expression hardened. You don't get it, do you? The Empire is strength. The Empire is destiny. You think you can change things. You think you can defeat them. You're nothing but a child playing in a world that's far too dangerous for you. Darien clenched his fists, stepping closer to Sarah. I won't let you do this, Sarah. I won't let you destroy everything we fought for. You think you can save yourself by siding with them, but you're wrong. They'll use you, just like they'll use everyone else. Sarah's smile faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. I don't have a choice, Darien. I never did. The Empire is my future. I can't just walk away from that. Darien shook his head. You're wrong. You have a choice. You've always had a choice. But you're choosing the wrong path. I didn't want this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I couldn't see another way. Darien took a step forward, his voice softening. There's always another way. We can still stop this. We can fix this. But before Sarah could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder. A group of soldiers emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn, their faces colden. Darien's heart sank. This wasn't over. But they weren't going to back down. Not now. Get ready, Darien muttered to Marcus and Lyra, his voice hardening with resolve. It's time to end this, once and for all. With a final defiant glance at Sarah, Darien and Lyra prepared to face whatever came next. The Empire had underestimated them, and now they would see just how far they were willing to go to protect the future they'd chosen. The tension in the air was unbearable as Darien, Lyra, and Marcus moved toward the abandoned factory on the edge of town. The sound of sirens grew louder as they approached, a constant reminder that the Empire was closing in. This was it, the moment they'd been preparing for, the moment that would decide everything. Darien could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His heart raced with adrenaline. But he didn't have time for fear. He had to focus. The Empire was coming for Lyra, and they would do whatever it took to stop her from escaping. But Darien had something that the Empire didn't. his unshakable will, his loyalty to the people he loved, and the courage to fight for what was right. Lyra, walking beside him, looked more determined than ever. She had come so far from the scared girl who had crash-landed on Earth. Now she was ready to fight for her freedom, for her future. Darien could see the fire in her eyes, the strength she'd gained over the past few days. She was no longer just someone who had been running from the Empire. She was someone who was ready to take a stand. Marcus was at their side, his expression stoic but sharp. He was the kind of person who could always think under pressure, and Darien trusted him to keep them focused and alert. "We need to find a way to slow them down," Marcus said quietly. "We can't let them reach us before we have a chance to strike." Darien nodded. "We'll have to move fast. If we get caught out in the open, we're done for. But if we get inside the factory, we can set up a trap." They reached the entrance, and Darien quickly led the way inside, his senses on high alert. The air was stale, and the silence was deafening. They had entered a labyrinth of industrial equipment and shadows, a perfect place for a final showdown. He could almost feel the Empire's soldiers closing in. But he wasn't about to back down. He wouldn't run anymore. Not for himself, not for Lyra. They had a chance now. They had to take it. As they moved deeper into the factory, the ground beneath their feet suddenly vibrated. It was a low hum, the sound of vehicles approaching. They were here. The Empire had arrived. "Get ready," Darien said to the others. His voice was low, but it was filled with purpose. They would fight to the end. A few moments later, they heard the first set of boots echoing through the factory. The Empire's soldiers were close. Darien and Lyra found cover behind a stack of crates, and Marcus positioned himself near the entrance, ready to spring into action. The first wave of soldiers appeared from the shadows, their armor gleaming under the dim factory lights. Darien held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, without warning, he lunged, grabbing one of the soldiers from behind and taking him down with a swift move. Lyra was right behind him, her movements fast and precise as she disarmed another soldier. The fight had begun. It was chaos. The sounds of metal clashing, grunts, and shouts filled the air as Darien, Lyra, and Marcus fought with everything they had. The Empire's soldiers were relentless, but the trio wasn't giving up. They fought together, each knowing the other's moves, covering each other's backs. They were more than just a team. They were a family, fighting for the future they believed in. Darien moved through the factory with precision, his heart pounding as he evaded another soldier's strike. He could see Lyra fighting with a fire he'd never seen in her before. She wasn't just defending herself, she was taking control of her destiny. And Marcus was a whirlwind, moving through the chaos with the sharp focus of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But even with their combined strength, the Empire's forces seemed endless. They fought for what felt like hours, each victory hard won, and each soldier that fell made Darien feel a little more exhausted. He was starting to doubt if they could actually win this. But then, as he turned to check on Lyra, he saw her. She was standing tall, defying the soldiers who had cornered her. And then, in a move that stunned Darien, she let out a powerful shout and unleashed a wave of energy that sent the soldiers flying. It wasn't just her physical strength. She had tapped into something deeper, something that had been buried inside her all along. The Empire's forces hesitated for a split second, and that was all they needed. Darien and Marcus pressed the attack, pushing the soldiers back with renewed strength. The tide was turning. The Empire's forces, overwhelmed by their courage and skill, began to retreat. As the last of the Empire's soldiers fell, the factory fell into an eerie silence. Darien stood there, breathless, surveying the battlefield. They had done it. They had won. Lyra walked over to him, her face tired but triumphant. "We did it," she said, her voice steady. Darien smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Yeah, we did." The future was theirs.